afternoon. Dr. Alp Aslandogan is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Shared Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that promotes bringing together citizens of diverse backgrounds and around shared values of humanity. The Alliance acts as an umbrella for other nonprofit organizations around the U.S. and promotes a culture of living in harmony and peace despite differences, to reduce social tensions, those that arise from false stereotypes and misinformation, to eliminate prejudice and discrimination against all or any ethnic, cultural, or religious communities. Prior to his current position, Dr. Aslandogan served as the board president of the Institute of Interfaith Dialogue in Houston, Texas, where he oversaw the organization of academic as well as grassroots activities of the Institute around topics such as shared values of humanity, social cognition, and conflicts, the arts of living together, foundations and methodology of interfaith and intercultural dialogue, and the role of faithful citizens in democracy. Dr. Aslandogan is the co-editor with Dr. Robert Hunt of Southern Methodist University of a book entitled Muslim Citizens of the Globalized World, Contributions of the Gulen Movement, published by the Institute of Interfaith Dialogue. Dr. Aslandogan is an author and an editor of the Fountain magazine and a board member of the Journal of Interreligious Dialogue. He publishes a column on the Huffington Post. His comments on the Hizmet movement appeared on PBS Religion and Ethics program CBS 60 Minutes and Voice of America. Dr. Aslandogan obtained his PhD in computer science from the University of Illinois at Chicago and served as a faculty member at the University of Texas at Arlington and Prairie View A&M University. He also holds a Master of Science degree in computer science from Case Western Reserve University, a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science and mathematics from Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. He has published several articles in peer-reviewed journals and conference proceedings in the field of database systems, multimedia information retrieval, computer vision, and computer-aided medical diagnosis. Between 2001 and 2007, he served as a faculty member at University of Texas at Arlington and Prairie View A&M University. In 2007, he became the director of Texas Gulf Institute in Houston, Texas. Between 2009 and 2012, he served as president of North American College, also in Houston, Texas. And in 2012, Dr. Aslandogan became the president of the Alliance of Shared Values, where he currently serves as the executive director. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Alp Aslandogan.
Dean Carter, Ambassador Chaudhry, esteemed honorees and guests. After this introduction, I'm feeling a little older. Please excuse me. One cannot always be a hero, but one can always be a human. The famous German writer and philosopher Goethe is credited with this saying. One cannot always be a hero, but one can always be a human. Often what it takes to build peace and justice and tranquility is not heroism, but simply choosing to be human, to end the needless suffering of humans in the hands of fellow human beings. What it takes is simply choosing to be human. To be sure, heroes remind us our common humanity. They lead by example. to stand for the dignity of fellow human beings. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he remains the most iconic hero of the American Civil Rights Movement. We recognize some other names, such as Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, and we have seen in the morning many others in our tour of the chapel, and many others will remain nameless. But equally important were the millions of citizens, black and white, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, agnostic, humanitarian, and others, who took their places in the marches, in the boycotts, in the sit-ins. They did not need to be heroes. They were simply being humans. Let me share with you briefly the story of Mr. Fethullah Gülen, who will be honored by the Peace Award this evening, and the social movement he inspired, starting in Turkey. This social movement, which seeks to combine inner, deeper spirituality with social action, is known as Gülen movement in the West. This is a term that Mr. Gülen actually detests. It is known as Hizmet in Turkey, and by other names as well. In Turkish, Hizmet literally means service, serving your community. The participants of the Hizmet movement, they do not strive to be heroes. They simply choose to be human and serve fellow human beings. Mr. Gülen started his career a little later than Dr. King in the 60s in Turkey. And those years in Turkey were characterized by street anarchy, politically, ideologically driven street anarchy. I remember those days as a middle school student. At night we would hear people running on the streets and the police would shout, "Freeze, stop." We would hear gunshots. In the morning we would wake up and we would find walls filled with political, ideological graffiti. You could not pick up a newspaper, one newspaper at a newsstand and go walking, because you could end up in the wrong neighborhood with that newspaper and you could get beaten. The economy was in shambles, unemployment and high inflation were rampant. And on top of all of these, there was the legacy of discrimination in the government institutions against large segments of the population. Unequal treatment, profiling, job discrimination for the beliefs and the lifestyles of certain citizens. To counter these social ills and other social ills, Mr. Gülen began advocating for investing in education, investing in youth. He promoted teaching as a noble profession. He encouraged bright young minds to consider careers in teaching, although they could become doctors and engineers and lawyers. He encouraged those with financial means to fund scholarships and dormitories and schools. He reminded parents that they could not delegate the education of their children to the government. They had to take responsibility. He believed that through education we could nurture individuals, as Ambassador Chaudhry pointed out in his address. Through education we could nurture individuals who will respect each other despite the differences. Through education, we can provide career opportunities and cycles of discrimination. The initial focus on education, starting in the 60s and 70s, continued throughout decades. And today, there are over 1,000 schools, sometimes known as Gülen schools or Hizmet schools or Turkish schools around the world in over 160 countries. These schools are succeeding with a secular curricula in math and science and humanities and arts, and especially language education. Every school teaches at least 2 languages, usually 3 or 4 languages, for boys and girls. What started out as a grassroots movement, grassroots community around Mr. Gülen with a handful of individuals in the 60s, turned into a transnational movement in the 90s with millions of participants. Within the last 3 decades, starting in the 90s, the activities of the movement participants diversified from education into humanitarian relief, into healthcare, into dialogue, interfaith, intercultural, intracultural, intrafaith dialogue. Inspired by Mr. Gülen's message and life example, his MET participants traveled and moved into places and provided much needed support. Educators went to war-torn countries like Bosnia, and they started schools bringing together Bosnian and Serbian kids so that when they grow up, they will not end up in the same situation as their parents. In Philippines, they brought together Muslim and Christian students under the same roof. In places like Afghanistan, they earned the trust of parents so that they could provide education to their daughters. Doctors and humanitarian workers went to places like Somalia and Sudan, Darfur, to serve the sick. Businessmen accompanied them to start medical centers so that the services will be there permanently. One particular anecdote that was shared with me a couple of months ago was very touching for me as a parent and husband myself. This was the summer of 2014, around August timeframe, in northern Iraq, near the city of Erbil. In one of these towns, there is a school established by the Hizmet participants. And in that summer, when the teachers and the administrators were about to return from the summer break to their school, they got the news that ISIS was threatening to occupy the city. The Kurdish Regional Authority, they were fighting ISIS with their forces, but they were short in supplies, in ammunition and weaponry. So the city was in danger of being occupied by ISIS. So the teachers and the principal were given a choice. They could delay the opening of the school and remain safe in Turkey or wherever they were, or they could go ahead and start the school. For me, it would have been a difficult choice as a parent myself, but for them it was not a difficult choice. They went ahead and visited every family, every parent. They told them, we are here, we are starting school on time. They were not heroes, if we ask them. They were not being heroes, they were just being humans. In all of these activity areas, in education, in dialogue, in healthcare, humanitarian aid, the focus is always on the human being. Because every social ill starts with the mindset of the human beings. And it can only solve through the longer term by addressing that mindset and by changing that mindset. Education for nurturing healthy mindsets. Dialogue for recognizing our common humanity, our shared values. Healthcare for helping those in need make their lives more livable. Humanitarian relief to prevent people from falling into desperation, which is the ultimate source of terrorism. Hizmet participants who came to the United States for various reasons, also started institutions like the Atlantic Institute here, in the same areas, in education, in dialogue, in humanitarian relief. I am the executive director of the Alliance for Shared Values. We are an umbrella for 6 other organizations in the area of interfaith, intrafaith, intercultural dialogue that are built upon a premise. And the premise is that, regardless of our backgrounds, ethnic, religious, national, human beings, we share core values, such as the value of life, the value of integrating your rhetoric and action, and the compassion and justice for all. Humanity indeed has made amazing progress within the last 3 centuries. But our progress in terms of how we treat each other pales in comparison. Would you agree? We can send robotic explorers to the Mars and we get back nice pictures of Mars surface. But sometimes we have difficulty reaching out to our neighborhoods a couple of miles away. We have put men on the moon, but it's proving much more difficult to put men or women on a decent payroll. Collectively, we have eradicated diseases that used to take lives, thousands of them, in a matter of a few days. But eradicating social diseases, racism, bigotry, stereotyping, discrimination, is proving to be much, much harder. And I just saw Dr. King's inscription on the wall this morning. We have done all of those things. We have learned to fly and swim and sent robotic missions to Mars, but we have not yet learned the simple art of being together as brothers and sisters. Totalitarian mindsets that have devastated the world in the form of fascism, communism in the past century, they left their places into new forms of brutality in the hands of terrorist groups or in the hands of repressive regimes. This wide gap between our technological progress and our social progress, or the lack thereof. Perhaps it is because we have misdiagnosed the source of human suffering, the root cause of human suffering. Or perhaps we have not been really honest to ourselves. Instead of recognizing and addressing all dimensions of the social realities, the political, the economic, the psychological, the historic, and religious, and other dimensions, instead of recognizing these dimensions, and also recognizing our responsibilities, sometimes within those social ills, we have instead chosen the shortcuts of blaming and scapegoating. We have failed to recognize that the real enemy of peace and justice is not differences in anything, not differences in religion, nation, ethnicity, or class, but instead human vices such as greed and domination and supremacy that dresses themselves up in those garments of religion and ethnicity and others. The real culprit in social ills is not just this group or that group, but instead a mindset that is nurtured in an environment, and it manifests itself in this group or that group. Instead of focusing on curing these tendencies, these ills, changing mindsets, we succumb to the shortcuts of scapegoating and stigmatizing. We blame blacks or whites, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Americans, Arabs, the rich or the poor for various things. And we fail to do our own introspection. Do they reflect something from my own shadow? Those already committed to blaming and scapegoating, it's going to be easy for them to find evidence to support their argument. But for those who would rather be part of the solution, or in Mother Teresa's terms, for those who would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, there are clear ways of doing something, being part of the solution. Activism and advocacy, as exemplified by Dr. King, is one such way, raising consciousness among adults, moving them to fulfill the promise of their humanity. It has been instrumental in social change. Education is another path which yields results in the longer term. It yields robust results, but you need to be patient and persistent. The change in the mindsets of individuals then reflect themselves in how the institutions are run, policies are drafted, and the money is spent, and the laws are made. And in the morning again, Dr. Carter was talking about, Dr. Brandeis, if I remember correctly, talking about a generation of lawyers. Generations of lawyers takes time and persistence and vision. Mr. Gulen, who is being recognized with the Gandhi King Ikeda Peace Award this evening, is someone who realized, like others, like Dr. King, early on that there are no shortcuts to social renewal. There are no shortcuts to social renewal. He chose the route of advocacy for wholesome education that nurtures not only the mind through math and science, but also the soul through languages, arts, humanities, cultural exchanges, trips to countries and regions, and character education. He, like many other advocates before him, realized that we don't need heroes to achieve peace and justice and tranquility. We just need to be humans. We just need to learn to be humans. But is it easy? Did we set the bar too low, or did we even fail to meet that bar? Mr. Gülen often relates a prayer by his beloved teacher, Muhammed Lutfi of Erzurum in eastern Turkey. This Sufi teacher, Muhammad Lutfi, who made a profound impact in Gülen's thinking, he used to pray many times every day. Every day, many times he would pray, "Oh God, please make us true humans. Oh God, please make us true humans." Definitely his bar for the true humanity was much higher than ours. To be sure, for those who long for more peaceful and more equitable world, the human condition is not always encouraging. Just follow the news. Destruction is always easier, much easier than construction. It is disproportionately easier than construction. It takes several man-months to build a house, and it takes one man, a few matches, and a couple of hours to burn it down. Bridges of trust that took years to build among people who are in conflict, who are stakeholders to a conflict, and Ambassador Shadu would know this best. Bridges of trust that takes years to build can be broken easily by a few irresponsible people overnight. Because the human brain is focused to learn from the negative. It is programmed to focus on the negative. It takes much more time and effort to rebuild the trust, to mend the bridges that were burned. Sometimes the peace workers and those dedicated to a more humane world may feel exasperated. They may feel disillusioned and even desperate. And trusting that you might have felt these feelings at some point in your life. So I'd like to leave you with a story of encouragement, which inspired me many times when I felt miserable seeing the situation in various places around the world. In the Muslim tradition, there is a folk story about Abraham, which is based in part in the Quranic story of Abraham, which I'm sure overlaps with biblical story of Abraham to some degree. So the Quranic story tells us that Abraham, Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him, was put to fire by the Nimrod, the autocratic ruler of his time, for spreading mischief in the land. And that mischief, of course, was monotheism. In contrast to the space star worship that was prevalent in the region, in Mesopotamia at the time. So he was put to fire, and he is about to be consumed in this big fire. And Quranic story stops there and just tells us that God told the fire to be cool and comfortable to Abraham, and he was saved by a miracle. But the folk story continues, and that's my inspiring reminder to you. So the folk story continues that when Abraham was about to be consumed by all accounts, there appeared a little bird, and it dropped a little bit of water on the fire from its beak. So Abraham, seeing this bird drop the water and go away, shouted, "Oh bird, do you realize that this little bit of water is not going to make a difference in this fire?" The bird turned around and said, "I realize that. But I do my part, and I want the world to know that I'm on your side." So, striving on the side of the peace and justice by simply choosing to be human, let alone being a hero. We may or may not achieve success in the larger social scale. We may or may not see a more peaceful world in our lifetimes. But we will certainly have done our part. We will certainly achieve our inner peace, which is the start of the broader peace. And certainly the world will know on what side we were. Thank you for your attention.